Welcome back to Talkin' Soccer. I am Justin Hoiniker, your host, and thank you all for tuning in. If you're listening on the Substack, if you're a paid subscriber, thank you all so much. You make the world go round for me. If you're on YouTube, Spotify, your favorite audio listening device, thank you all so much for listening, and be sure to subscribe, give it a like if this is your first time stumbling upon my page. But as always, we got a lot to talk about today on Talking Soccer. The expansion draft, San Diego FC, the roster is starting to take place. Things are starting to crystallize a little bit, and I got some thoughts about what San Diego have done so far. Some good, some bad, some just light analysis of what's been happening. And for this time of year, you might think December is slowing down, the MLS Cup final is over, the NWSL final is over, but soccer never sleeps. We had FIFA awarding 2 World Cups this week, and that'll be a conversation for the podcast next week. I also have a pretty deep dive coming on Talking Soccer over the weekend. So make sure you're subscribed if you want to see what I have to say about Gianni Infantino and Saudi Arabia. So, all right, let's talk about San Diego. Their expansion draft was Wednesday. But I want to lay the groundwork by just going over what this roster looks like and just what I think their biggest areas of need are. Because I think there are some clear areas of need, most notably starting goalkeeper. But I also think there have been some good moves, and the best move is to focus on the academy. So for those of you that don't know, San Diego FC has partnered with Right to Dream Academy. They have shared ownership in that, and Right to Dream is responsible for creating pros essentially all over the world. So they're using that framework that they used with Right to Dream to produce, countless professionals at this point. They've also kind of started to use that Right to Dream network as well to find players to play for San Diego. But I think, most importantly, they signed Duran Ferry to homegrown contract. That was their first signing. So really to set the tempo of what San Diego is going to be, the first signings were a homegrown keeper from San Diego, played for the San Diego Loyal in their final season, and then Chucky Lozano, Mexican international for San Diego. Their location and their academy, it all ties in, right? So Chucky Lozano is Mexican international, plays for El Tri, and is going to, give that fan base that not dual national, but there's a lot of crossover there between, English fans, between Mexican fans, and their location on the border to really tap into both those fan bases and to give their, Mexican fans something to identify with straight away. But San Diego, of course, essentially located within a few miles of Tijuana on the other side of the border. And for FIFA, what that allows them to do is to be able to scout Tijuana as well as San Diego for their, to include in their academy rights, so that they can dip into Mexico. Because of that, they have a real strategic placement in terms of why it was important for San Diego to not only get a franchise, but to lean so heavily into youth development. 'Cause obviously, San Diego itself is a pipeline, but Tijuana as well. There's a lot of young players that if they do it right, they set up this academy right, they could be kind of the union of the West Coast, if not for a completely different play style and willingness to spend non-designated players. But Chucky Lozano, if you have paid attention, he has started to decline a bit. 29, turns 30 next year, but to start the Eredivisie season for PSV Eindhoven this year, he has kind of turned back the clock again. So there's no reason to believe, especially as maybe those numbers dip in Europe, that against MLS defenses, that he should still be a fairly good designated player. Definitely not the worst DP in the league. Definitely not just a name signing, not just a marketable signing, but also for what they are trying to build, for what Tyler Hughes is trying to build in San Diego. If you have speedy wingers, which it seems like that is what they are trying to implement with all of their signings, essentially, Chucky Lozano, Alex Mighton, also, that like to really emphasize that speed out in the wing is something that it seems like they are going to be building for, they're going to be working towards, and that's some of that like US men's national team blueprint DNA as well, with Mikey Veras being the first year manager. So there are reasons to be concerned, but Chucky Lozano is not one. Also, Marcus Ingvartsen, of course, he scored double-digit goals for Mainz 2 years ago in the Bundesliga. 10 goals for Mainz. He's been pretty good for Nordjylland this year as well. And I think he's going to be a player that, like, as long as, that's the thing with strikers, right? With strikers, the thing is that, especially on expansion sides in St. Louis, we've seen this with João Klaus, with Nico Gioacchini, with Simon Betcher, that it's very reliant on the service that they can get. And for a player that is more of that typical 9, to be able to, he might have to do some of that dirty work as well. But obviously, to have that pedigree of Europe, to score in the Bundesliga the way that he has, to come to MLS now with a slightly more chaotic defensive structure league-wide, San Diego's attack is good. I feel confident saying that. Like, that is for sure the strongest aspect of this roster build. I mentioned Alex Mighten earlier, but Alex Mighten is another speedy winger, speedy attacker. But the big asterisk there is that he hasn't really shown that he can do it in a top flight league. He looked okay with Nottingham Forest in the championship. When they were promoted, he did not make many appearances for the Premier League and ended up playing more matches for Forest 2 for the reserve side, for the reserve league, than he did for Forest in the Premier League. That is not necessarily saying that as a 22-year-old that he's a flop, this is a bad signing, but what it is saying is that there's still a lot of questions around whether he is going to be able to hit the ground running in MLS, because he hasn't necessarily, even in the Premier League Reserve League, he hasn't, Premier League 2 League, he hasn't really shown an ability to hit the ground running and to create and produce on his own. So San Diego, and this will be a reoccurring theme, we'll have to hope that they know something that no one else does, and that their emphasis on youth development, their emphasis on development isn't just about the academy and the 2 team, but also the first team as well. Moving on, Jeppe Verskov, also from Nordjylland. Again, that connection that San Diego has, especially with Right to Dream, is another midfielder that I think is going to be okay for them, especially in MLS. He has shown the ability to contribute for Nordjylland, and he's a player that it seems like, especially as an 8, should be pretty strong. They also signed Paddy McNair, who plays left back, so they have some of a defensive backbone coming together. He previously at Middlesbrough, so championship, left back, that should translate pretty well. And then we kind of move on from the pre-signing. So those are coming into this past week. That was kind of where San Diego were at. So the roster was looking pretty thin, but they were able to make some moves heading into the draft and then on draft night as well. Chris McVeigh from DC United, they acquired him ahead of the draft, previously of Inter Miami as well. He's another player that can play fullback, but maybe not a player that you want to rely on to play fullback, but definitely MLS veteran coverage, is familiar with the league, has played in Miami, won Leagues Cup with Miami, so has some sort of a pedigree, but very much a okay player, is how I'm going to classify that. And didn't have to give up a ton for him. Again, that MLS experience is important. That's something that helped St. Louis in year 1, was to have MLS experience on the roster. They did a decent job with that. They also acquired Tomas Angel, who LAFC didn't really play much for LAFC yet, had yet to really break through, but he is a Columbia Youth International, a player with clear upside, obviously, but be it either the setup in LAFC, the depth of LAFC, he had never really had the opportunity to break through into the lineup yet. So they acquire Angel from LAFC, and you kind of have that chip on your shoulder as well. San Diego want to be a rival to those LA teams, to San Jose, that California rivalry. And for Angel, still young, still a lot to prove. Will turn 22 at the start of next season. So again, still very young. And I think sometimes we view international players and players who signed from the academy who have been playing pro soccer for a long time very differently than we view like college players. So like Angel, if he were an NCAA player, like might not even be coming out of the draft this year or would be drafted in MLS, and everyone would be talking about him that doesn't quite understand about how, high draft pick, this player's going to be good. But yet you have a player who has played top flight minutes, who has been loaned out, who has played for the Columbia Youth International team, hasn't really broken through yet, and there's not a lot of buzz there. So it is interesting to see like how that dichotomy of not being in the NCAA system for a player that has been young and kind of trying to find his way, but still has a lot of time to develop. I think we a lot of times write players off by the time they turn 22 and 23, and what San Diego has kind of done is taken those players that have maybe been written off already, and they're going to have an opportunity to show what they're worth in San Diego. I'm sure there'll be more moves, of course, especially with MLS free agency open, with the transfer window in January. They have a lot of work to do still, but I have, if you're looking at it from an optimistic stance of the players that they brought in ahead of the draft, that you can see kind of what they're trying to do there. Okay, so coming into draft night, the big rumor is that they were trading with New York Red Bulls to acquire Andre Reyes. Andre Reyes, he scored the game-winning goal of the Eastern Conference Final to send the Red Bulls into the final, and then was sick 5 to 10 minutes before the match in LA, and to the point where they had to take him out. He was unavailable to play. And I think, not to say that burned a bridge, but there seems to be some hard feelings there. The Red Bulls press release, when they made this trade eventually, didn't even include a quote. Like, that's usually pretty commonplace, that like, oh, thanks for coming, thanks for being here. But that wasn't seen from the Red Bull side. So like, it seems like there's some hard feelings. Sandro Schwartz like also said that put him in a tough spot. But like, if he's sick and he's throwing up and he can't play, like, I don't know how you hold that against him unless they just don't believe him. But what is the Red Bulls' loss will be San Diego's gain. We're going to talk about how they acquired the GAM that they used to acquire Andre Reyes. So they're going to acquire him for $750,000 of GAM, which sounds like a lot, but by the end of Wednesday night, San Diego had recouped most of that back through the draft. So let's talk about the expansion draft. San Diego made 5 picks. They kept 3 of them. They flipped 2 of them. Let's start with the flips. Earlier in the day, I heard that Jose Kojima was being picked by San Diego, and then that they were flipping him to DC for $400,000 in GAM. So St. Louis are going to get $50,000 in GAM for having a player picked. San Diego would then flip him to DC for $400,000 in GAM, which is like quite, I don't want to say a fleecing, but it's quite a sore spot for St. Louis. But when you look at their roster, when you look at the players who were still left unprotected, for them to pick Jose Kojima, not pick Celio Pompeo, Kyle Hebert, Joachim Nielsen, even Josh Yaro, I think that Kojima, even though he has a lot of upside, and again, he was a super draft pick last year, still relatively young, 22, will turn 23 next season, is a very versatile player. I think has a higher upside than what he's even shown so far, but he's a player that St. Louis will be able to replace most easily. Tomas Ostrak coming back into the lineup for St. Louis this year. Their midfield is very deep from a depth chart perspective, and they also have homegrowns that are ready to make the step up in Caden Glover, in Tyson Pierce, that can both play in the positions that Jose Kojima would play in. So he's going to be you hate to say that a player is easily replaceable, but out of those players I named earlier, he's the player that would be most easily to replace. He only played 500 minutes for St. Louis last year. A lot of that is because of the vast injury crisis that St. Louis was in. It's hard to see a way for him, as much as the fan base liked him, as much as his teammates liked him. If any player is going to be picked in the expansion draft, that's probably a better case scenario than what could have been. However, that isn't to say that St. Louis were happy to let him go. We're happy to watch him leave. It was definitely not the plan. They did not want to watch him leave, but to have any player picked, that is maybe the best case scenario. But it seemed like St. Louis was always going to get targeted just because of the depth of the roster, where they aren't necessarily star heavy, but they have a lot of players who can be good players, especially for an expansion side, that a lot of players that were still unprotected had that expansion experience. But they're going to pick Kojima. They flip him to DC for $400,000. Keep that number in the back of your head. They also picked Thiago Andrade from NYCFC. This is a bit of I think NYCFC will be a little bit happier about this. Of course, they brought him in thinking that he was going to be that U22 player that took that next step that they could flip for a profit, or flip to one of the other Citigroup teams. But he had been on loan for the last 20 months, never really seemed to be in the plans for NYCFC, didn't seem to be in the plans for NYCFC this year. So again, a player that, as much as they'll hate to lose an asset that they would have hoped to come good, San Diego pick him. They flip him to Toronto for if performance incentives are hit. So this is the big thing, because Andrade, I don't know if he will be able to make the roster in Toronto, if he will play much for Toronto, for what we've seen from him in the past couple of years. But if he hits those performance incentives, San Diego get $250,000 in GAM, and then there's also a sell-on percentage if he gets traded, sold outside of the league. And that's also a intriguing move from like NYC and Toronto, same conference, like regionally. They're not necessarily rivals, but like New York and Toronto are kind of rivals just because of their proximity. In Toronto, I think if he is to stick anywhere, Toronto have the need for it more than NYCFC. So again, another one of those situations where even though the teams don't necessarily want it, it's best for probably what is best for the player given the competition level on both squads. So those are the two picks that San Diego make that they aren't going to keep. So the picks that they are going to hold on to, Hani Gilkling-Bruseth of Orlando City. He was brought in. I'm sorry for my pronunciation of that name. I know it's going to be nowhere close, but Orlando bring him in last summer for 1.5 million euros. He doesn't play a single minute in Major League Soccer, and maybe this is a case of cutting ties, being able to dip back into the market this upcoming year, use that U22 slot. So he would take up a U22 slot for San Diego. So maybe Orlando City didn't like what they saw when they got him to Orlando, but for U22 signings especially, I always feel like that first half of season, I think for a lot of signings, but especially for young players, Heine is 20 years old. So this is a very young player still. And I often feel like that first 6 months from the summer transfer window to the end of the season for those players is just kind of getting used to the league, getting used to training, getting used to this new environment. He's coming from Northern Europe to Central Florida. So it's quite the shift, I would imagine. And now he's going all the way across America, halfway across the country from Norway. But he's a youth international for Norway. Seems like a player with high upside. Seems like a player that should work in Major League Soccer, that you should be able to move on down the line. But we've also seen players like this not work out, right? So there's no given here, and we have no basis for understanding of what he could be in Major League Soccer. But I think San Diego, if they're looking at, okay, which players are going to be A, cheap, and B, have upside, this is kind of where they came. Because I think a big criticism of this draft strategy is there is a lot of just value on the table that San Diego left. Like Julian Gressel was available. And that would have been a player, especially with San Diego's stated style, that I think would have been very, very good for them. But for whatever reason, they decided to go this way. I also thought like Paul Arriola is a San Diego native. Like that seemed like a no-brainer too, but they went in a completely different direction. Next out, they picked Jasper Löffelsend he's a German, Colorado, played central defensive mid, had an up and down season. He broke through, like originally signed in Salt Lake to play for their MLS Next Pro team, earned a promotion into Salt Lake, was picked up by Colorado by the Rapids, had a pretty strong 2023 for a holding midfield, was very capable, I would say. Picked up an injury earlier into 2024 and then could never really played, but never really earned that spot back. And in a 2024 Rapid squad that was much better than their 2023 iteration. So as a depth CDM, Colorado are probably okay to see him go. But for Löffelsend, it's a question of can he get back to where he was before that injury in 2024? Can he get back to that 2023 form? And if so, then I think that he'll be good in San Diego. I mean, at the very least, he offers a veteran presence that's familiar with the league. And again, another international. They have, I don't know where they're going to get enough international spots. I say the same about St. Louis, but I don't know why they went so heavy internationally when there were domestic players available that they could have made their lives a little bit easier. But there's a plan there, I think. For their final signing, they picked Hamady Diop. Diop was a number 1 overall pick for Charlotte, was the best player in college during his time at Clemson, but hasn't quite hit yet. And maybe that's Charlotte playing him out of position, not knowing what his best position is. Maybe it's Charlotte's play style, what have you. But there's clearly something that he showed in college that he hasn't showed at the pro level yet. He played no minutes after summer in Charlotte. So that's a player in need of a change, in need of a change of scenery, in need of a change of location. Going from East Coast to West Coast, I think could be good for him. And obviously there is upside there. Still a young player, even though 2 years off now of that super draft. He is 23 years old. So starting to get to that point where, it's make or break for him. But going to San Diego, I think he'll have opportunities unless they sign a ton of players in the January window. What I do think they need to do, because right now they did make a couple goalkeeper moves. They signed CJ Dos Santos out of Inter Miami, who was their backup keeper, their third keeper really, and Jacob Jackson, who was also kind of San Jose's third keeper. So they still need a starting keeper, because I don't think you give Jackson, Dos Santos, or your 18-year-old keeper coming in the starting minutes. They need a starting goalkeeper. You can't be a team that is respectable in MLS without a starting goalkeeper that has been there before, that can give you saves. Because I think with both Dos Santos and with Jackson, there were opportunities this year to take starts that they didn't. And I think that tells you a lot about where they are in their development, especially San Jose. Nathan goes down, and instead of giving Jackson a run out, they go to a 34-year-old who was okay. So there were opportunities for both of them to grab starts. There's a period of time in Miami this year where Drake Callender was kind of faltering. He got that form back towards the end of the season, and I think they are going to try to upgrade the goalkeeping position there as well. But two players that, as of right now, are backup keepers. Now, so that's a splash they need to make in the January window, or in MLS free agency. I think if I'm looking at the free agent list, a name that would do a lot of good for San Diego, but my thinking and San Diego's thinking don't align at all, would be a player like Tim Melia, who probably has 1-2 years tops left in his body in Major League Soccer, has shown that he can be He had a bit of a down year this year, but has shown that he can be one of the better keepers in MLS, and at the very least would give you kind of a stable ground. And maybe you bring him in to be a starter, and either Dos Santos or Jackson can kind of step up and with that competition take the job from him. But to have a player who has been a starter in the league for a decade at this point to be there to like mentor your young 18-year-old keeper that you think is going to be the future is potentially good as well. There's a lot of players in MLS free agency that if San Diego can put the right package together and can put the right sell together, they could find a lot of value there. But again, I think they're trying to keep this roster somewhat, not say cheap, but especially outside of those DP, those U22 spots, like trying to find value in young players that they can move on or young players that they can mentor to step up, because they have like seemed to want to take swings. So obviously Chucky Lozano, no one thought that he was going to be ready to come to MLS yet. He does. San Diego make that move. And while he isn't the splashiest of DP signings for what San Diego want to do to tap into that like Mexican market as well as the American market, you're kind of towing two lines. And that was a very good signing. And they've been linked with Kevin De Bruyne. I think those talks have cooled down quite a bit. It seems like it's not happening, but they've been linked to one of the best midfielders to ever play the game, for especially as in a creative sense of what De Bruyne does. So I think it gives you an idea of what they're looking for. They're looking for a DP, creative midfielder. Like that seems to be in MLS as well, where you get the most bang for your buck as far as that DP spot. But yeah, they still have a lot to do around the edges and in the middle for San Diego. This is not anywhere close to a finished roster. And I think that maybe doesn't bode well for year one for them. And maybe January window is packed. They get the players in time. They have a good preseason. They hit the ground running. But when I look to how the last couple expansion teams have done, St. Louis and Charlotte, both kind of having opposite ends of the spectrum, where St. Louis were able to come in, hit the ground running because they're kind of like blessing in disguise of COVID, allowing them or forcing them essentially to push their start date back. But they started the academy 2 years before the first team. They started the 2 team the year before the first team came in. And with that, they brought in a lot of the players that would be the stars on that year one roster to play for the 2 team. Eddie Leuven, Roman Berkey, João Klaus, Thomas Ostrak were all like Kyle Hebert, Celio Pompeo, like won their jobs because of their performance with the 2 team that year. And the ability for them to play together, to establish their culture before they made that jump to the first team. John Hackworth coached that 2 team. He stayed on as technical director. He was interim coach this year. So to have that connectivity from like your DPs, your big players that came to St. Louis 6 months before the start of the season, and then to take that and ride that into that first 6-game wave where they won their first 6 matches, and that's essentially what carried them to that first place finish in the West, because the West had a very bad year, all things considered. And then if you look at Charlotte, and their first season was a bit of a mess, and they had to like hard pivot from that first year and to the point where they made the playoffs this year. And like soccer in Charlotte and the atmosphere in Charlotte is great, but that first year had a lot of growing pains, and it feels like that is more or less what San Diego is gearing up for. They seem more on the Charlotte track of they're doing good things elsewhere with their academy, with setting up young players to succeed, but as far as nailing the DPs, nailing the coaching selection, like Mikey Veras has never been head coach at a top flight level before. He's always been assistants or a age group coach. So while he has that experience and obviously knows the market, knows the league, knows the players, hasn't ever showed that he can be like a winning manager in that way before. So there's a lot of ifs, there's a lot of questions. What can this team do? What can this team be? And like that doesn't fill me with a ton of confidence right away. But that could all change with like one huge signing in the January window. So we'll leave it there. That is how San Diego looks heading into free agency, heading into the transfer window. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Where do you think they're going to finish this year? If I'm looking at their roster, trying to project, a DP that makes a difference, like they're definitely not a playoff team. Probably San Jose definitely gets better under Bruce Arena. Like, I think that with how Sporting KC are built right now, like this team is better than that, even in their current state. But like, does that change in January? Who knows? But I think it might be a rough start to life. But maybe I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong. I'd love to see this team hit the ground running, but I just don't see it as things stand right now. There are pieces there for sure, but they have a lot of work to do to build around it. So, as always, folks, thank you so much for listening. Of course, like I said before, I have a big piece coming up this weekend just talking about everything going on in FIFA right now. So make sure you subscribe to Talking Soccer if you aren't already. And I will be back next week to talk some NWSL stuff. There's some interesting academy news coming out and just like trying to forecast, what the NWSL academy space might look like next year heading into the future, as well as just like my general women's soccer talk, because there are some interesting things abroad that I want to touch on that have a shocking relevance to U.S. soccer right now. So anyway, thank you all so much for watching, for listening, wherever you are. Make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, come back next time, and we'll talk real soon.